The morning light filtered through ancient oak trees as I walked the perimeter of my 10-acre property. It had taken me 15 years of saving every penny to afford this slice of rural paradise. Most of my neighbors were decent, hard-working people who valued privacy and respect for boundaries. We all understood the unwritten rules of country living: mind your business, help when asked, and respect property lines. The jewel of my land was the 2-acre pond that stretched along the eastern edge. I had spent countless weekends clearing invasive plants, building a small dock, and stocking it with native fish species. The water sparkled in the sunlight, reflecting the cloud patterns above. This pond was more than a water feature. It was my sanctuary, my retirement project, my place of peace after decades of working construction in the city. I first noticed the issue in early spring. Tire tracks appeared near my property line, cutting through soft earth close to the pond. At first, I dismissed it as teenagers joyriding or perhaps a lost hunter. But the tracks kept appearing, weekend after weekend, each time pressing closer to my land. Then I saw her, a woman in her 50s on a bright red ATV, roaring along the edge of my property like she owned it. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, designer sunglasses perched on her nose despite the overcast day. She noticed me watching and gave a dismissive wave before gunning the engine and speeding away. My neighbor Tom stopped by that evening to help me fix a leaking gutter. "I see you have met Karen," he said, shaking his head as he handed me a wrench. "She moved into the development across the old logging road last year, thinks the rules do not apply to her." "She was riding pretty close to my property line," I mentioned, trying to sound casual about it. Tom snorted. "That is how it starts. She tried to force the Johnsons to cut down a 100-year-old maple tree because she claimed the leaves were blowing onto her driveway. Filed a complaint with the county when they refused." I frowned. "Their property is at least half a mile from the new development." "Exactly," Tom said, tightening the final bolt. "Distance does not matter to people like her. If she wants something, she believes she is entitled to it." I decided to handle the situation directly but politely. The next weekend, when I heard the familiar roar of her ATV, I walked to the edge of my property and waited. Karen came speeding along, this time actually crossing several feet onto my land before noticing me. She slowed to a stop, the engine of her vehicle still rumbling. "Beautiful day for a ride," she called out, as if we were old friends. "It is," I agreed, "but I would appreciate if you could stay on the public paths. This is private property." Karen tilted her head, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Oh, these trails have been used by everyone for years. They are practically community property at this point." "Actually, my deed clearly marks this as private land," I explained calmly. "I have invested a lot in maintaining the pond and the ecosystem around it." She laughed as if I had told an amusing joke. "Well, no one has ever complained before. I am sure we can share the space." Without waiting for my response, she revved her engine and sped away, deliberately cutting across my property and leaving deep tire tracks dangerously close to the pond's edge. As I watched her disappear into the distance, something told me this would not be a simple neighborhood disagreement. The casual disregard in her eyes suggested a person accustomed to getting her way, regardless of rules or boundaries. I did not know it then, but this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would test my patience, drain my bank account, and ultimately force me to stand my ground against a woman who believed the world existed to serve her whims. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store and purchased bright orange property markers and several no trespassing signs. The forecast predicted rain, but I spent the entire day marking my property line every 20 feet, driving the stakes deep into the ground to ensure they would remain visible. I took photographs of each marker with my cell phone, documenting their placement with the date and time stamps visible. Something told me I might need this evidence someday. Near the pond, where the ATV tracks had come closest to the water, I placed additional signs reading "Private Property, No Motorized Vehicles." I even added a specific warning about the uneven terrain near the pond edge. The signs were not particularly attractive against the natural landscape, but they were necessary. I had invested too much in this property to risk damage from a reckless trespasser. 3 days later, I returned from work to discover 5 of my markers pulled from the ground and 2 signs missing entirely. Tire tracks cut a winding path through my property, deliberately passing each marker location. This was not accidental trespassing. It was a message. I replaced the markers and installed a trail camera disguised as a birdhouse near the property line. The next weekend, the camera captured exactly what I suspected: Karen on her ATV, slowing down to deliberately remove a "no trespassing" sign before accelerating across my land. Her face was clearly visible as she looked directly at the camera and smirked, sign in hand, before tossing it into the underbrush. This had gone beyond annoying to deliberately malicious. I contacted the county sheriff's office to report the trespassing and vandalism. The deputy who responded seemed sympathetic but not particularly motivated. "Property disputes are generally civil matters," he explained, leaning against his patrol car. "Unless there is significant damage or threats made, there is not much we can do beyond taking a report." "She is deliberately removing legal property markers and signs," I pointed out. He nodded. "Document everything. Take photos, save video. If this escalates, you will need evidence. But honestly, most of these situations eventually resolve themselves when people get bored and move on to bothering someone else." His casual dismissal was frustrating, but I understood. Rural counties have limited resources, and property line disputes probably ranked low on their priority list. I would need to handle this myself. That evening, I researched property law at my kitchen table, the harsh glow of my laptop screen illuminating stacks of property documents and boundary surveys. After consulting several legal websites, I drafted a formal cease and desist letter. The language was polite but firm, explaining that 1. The property boundaries were legally established and clearly marked. 2. Her trespassing had been documented with video evidence. 3. Destruction of property markers and signs was potentially illegal. 4. Future trespassing would result in legal action. I sent the letter via certified mail, requiring a signature upon delivery. 3 days later, the return receipt arrived in my mailbox, confirming Karen had received my warning. I felt a small sense of satisfaction. Hopping this formal notice might finally resolve the situation. That satisfaction evaporated the following weekend. Not only did Karen continue riding across my property, but she now did so with greater frequency and aggression. The camera captured her deliberately running over newly planted saplings near the pond and stopping to kick over more of my property markers. The message was clear. She was escalating rather than backing down. Neighbors began to notice the situation. Ellen from 2 properties over stopped by with a basket of homemade bread. "We have all been watching what is happening," she said quietly. "That woman has been causing problems all over the county. Last summer, she tried to force the Historical Society to remove a century-old fence because it blocked her view of the lake from her back deck." "Did they remove it?" I asked. Ellen shook her head. "No, they stood their ground and eventually she moved on to harassing someone else." She paused, Just be careful. People like that can be surprisingly vindictive when they do not get their way. As winter approached, the situation seemed to reach a stalemate. Karen continued to trespass, though less frequently as the weather deteriorated. I continued to document each incident, replace damaged markers, and maintain a detailed record of her behavior. Little did I know that the worst was yet to come, and that a rainy spring day would transform this annoying boundary dispute into a legal nightmare that threatened everything I had worked for. March arrived with relentless rain that swelled the pond to its highest level in years. The ground around the water's edge had become soft and unstable, with sections near the eastern bank particularly treacherous. I had spent that morning reinforcing the area with erosion control measures, placing additional warning signs about the unstable ground conditions. The rain had finally stopped around noon, but dark clouds still hung low in the sky as I worked near the pond's edge. My boots sank inches into the mud with each step, a clear indication that no one should be driving any vehicle near this area. The soil was completely saturated, creating dangerous conditions even for careful walking. I was securing an erosion barrier when I heard it, the unmistakable roar of Karen's ATV, louder and more aggressive than usual. Turning toward the sound, I spotted her red vehicle tearing along my property line at a speed that seemed reckless even by her standards. Her blonde hair whipped behind her, no helmet in sight, as she aimed directly toward the pond access point I had just finished marking as dangerous. "Stop!" I shouted, waving my arms frantically. "The ground is unstable." Either she did not hear me over the engine noise or chose to ignore my warning. Karen actually accelerated, her face twisted in what appeared to be deliberate defiance as she blasted past my property markers and headed straight for the pond. The ATV bounced violently as it hit the uneven terrain, but she maintained her speed, heading directly toward the area I had just been working to secure. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The front wheels of her ATV hit the slick embankment at precisely the wrong angle. The saturated soil gave way immediately under the weight of the vehicle. The ATV bucked upward as the front wheels lost traction, sending Karen airborne in a graceless arc. She separated from the vehicle midair, arms flailing as she plummeted toward the pond. The splash was substantial as both Karen and the ATV crashed into the water about 15 feet from shore. The ATV quickly began to sink in the deeper section while Karen surfaced, sputtering and flailing. It was immediately clear she was in trouble, either injured or simply unable to swim effectively in her waterlogged clothes. Despite everything that had happened between us, I did not hesitate. I dropped my tools and rushed toward the water, kicking off my work boots as I ran. The cold water shocked my system as I plunged in, swimming powerfully toward Karen, who was now coughing and struggling to stay afloat. "I have got you," I said, reaching her and supporting her head above water. "Stop fighting and let me help you to shore." She coughed violently, expelling pond water, but stopped thrashing. I turned her onto her back and began towing her toward the shore using the life-saving technique I had learned years ago as a summer camp counselor. The taste of mud and pond water filled my mouth as I dragged her toward safety, my feet finally finding purchase in the soft bottom near the shore. As we reached shallow water, Karen began to regain her composure, though she was shivering violently from the cold. I helped her to a sitting position on dry ground and quickly retrieved an emergency blanket from my work shed nearby. "You need to get warm and dry," I said, wrapping the silver blanket around her shoulders. "I can call an ambulance if you are hurt." Karen looked up at me, water dripping from her hair, mascara streaking down her face. For a moment, I thought I saw gratitude in her eyes. That illusion shattered with her next words. "Your unsafe property caused this accident," she said between chattering teeth. "That pond is a hazard. You are liable for this." I stared at her in disbelief. "I just pulled you out of the water. You were trespassing on clearly marked private property after ignoring multiple warnings." She struggled to her feet, clutching the emergency blanket around her shoulders. "Those warnings were inadequate. This is negligence, pure and simple. My ATV is ruined and I could have been killed." "I literally just saved your life," I said, unable to keep the incredulity from my voice. Karen gathered what remained of her dignity, her expression hardening. "You will be hearing from my attorney. This death trap you call a pond should have been fenced off properly." She pulled out her phone, which had somehow survived the dunking in a waterproof case, and called someone to pick her up. As she walked toward the access road, leaving puddles with each step, she turned back once more. "You should start saving your money," she called out. "You are going to need it." I stood there, soaking wet and muddy, watching her retreat. My act of basic human decency had been rewarded with threats of legal action. The ATV remained partially submerged in my pond, leaking oil and gasoline into the water I had spent years nurturing. As I considered the environmental damage and the cost of removing the vehicle, anger began to replace my shock. This woman had trespassed repeatedly, ignored multiple warnings, damaged my property, and now had the audacity to threaten me with legal action after I saved her from drowning. As I trudged back to my house to change out of my wet clothes, I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a legal battle that would test not just my finances, but my commitment to standing up for what was right. The certified letter arrived exactly 17 days after the incident. It sat unopened on my kitchen table for hours, its official markings and return address from Harrington, Weiss and Associates, attorneys at law, filling me with dread. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, the contents were even worse than I had imagined. The letter claimed I had maintained an attractive nuisance and hazardous condition on my property. It alleged willful negligence and failure to secure dangerous features that had resulted in severe physical and emotional trauma to Karen Westfield. The damages sought totaled $175,000, more than my entire property was worth. My hands trembled as I set the letter down. The allegations were absurd, contradicting reality in almost every detail. The letter described my pond as an unmarked water hazard when I had meticulously documented every warning sign. It claimed Karen had been invited onto the property through an established easement. A complete fabrication, as no such easement existed on my deed. Sleep abandoned me that night. I lay awake calculating impossible math between my mortgage payments, potential legal costs, and basic survival. By morning, I knew I needed professional help. My savings could perhaps cover a legal consultation, but a prolonged court battle would financially ruin me. The law office of Patricia Gonzalez was modest compared to what I imagined Karen's attorneys worked in. The waiting room featured worn furniture and outdated magazines, but the diplomas on the wall and the confident handshake from Patricia herself suggested competence rather than luxury. "This is unfortunately not uncommon," Patricia said after reviewing the letter and my documentation of the incidents leading up to the accident. "Some people view property disputes and personal injury claims as lottery tickets." "Can she actually win?" I asked, my stomach nodding at the possibility. Patricia leaned back in her chair. "Based on what you have shown me, the documentation of trespassing, the warning signs, the certified letter you sent, and the video evidence, she has a very weak case. But that does not mean defending against it will be cheap or easy." "How much?" I asked, bracing myself. A retainer of $3,000 to start. If it goes to trial, potentially $15,000 to $20,000 total. She must have seen the color drain from my face because she quickly added, "There are options. We can file a countersuit for the damage to your pond, the environmental cleanup, and your legal expenses." As I drove home, the weight of the situation pressed down on me. I would need to take out a loan against my property, the very land I was fighting to protect, just to defend my right to keep it. That evening, my phone began buzzing with unexpected text messages. Tom, my neighbor who had first warned me about Karen, wrote, "Heard about the lawsuit. She tried this with the Johnsons 3 years ago when their dog allegedly scared her while she was walking through their orchard, which was also clearly marked private property." Ellen sent a longer message. "Remember how I mentioned the Historical Society fence? She sued them too, claiming she tripped on their property. They found evidence she had visited the spot multiple times before, taking photos of the dangerous condition without reporting it. Classic setup." More messages arrived throughout the evening from other neighbors I barely knew. Each shared similar stories. Karen had a history of trespassing, manufacturing accidents, and filing lawsuits. She had apparently attempted this scheme in 2 previous counties before moving to our area. The next morning, I called Patricia with this new information. "This changes things," she said, the smile evident in her voice. "If we can document a pattern of similar behavior, it strengthens our position considerably. Can any of these neighbors provide sworn statements?" "I think so," I replied, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time since receiving the lawsuit. "Good. Also, check her social media accounts. People like this often contradict their injury claims online." Following Patricia's advice, I created a temporary social media account and searched for Karen. What I found was astonishing. While her lawsuit claimed debilitating back and neck injuries from the ATV accident, her Instagram account showed her water skiing just 2 weeks after the incident. Even more damning, she had posted videos of herself performing reckless stunts on the same ATV she now claimed was forced off course by hazardous conditions. I forwarded everything to Patricia, who called me immediately. "This is exactly what we needed. Her own social media contradicts her sworn statements about her injuries. Now, we need to focus on documenting your property conditions on the day of the accident." That weekend, several neighbors helped me install security cameras covering my property line and the pond. The financial strain remained significant, but for the first time, I felt that justice might actually be possible. The community had recognized something I was only beginning to understand. This was not just about one pond or one accident. It was about standing up to someone who had been manipulating the legal system to terrorize an entire community. As I reviewed the mounting evidence against Karen's false claims, my fear began to transform into determination. I would not be intimidated into paying for her recklessness, no matter the cost. Sometimes, the only way to stop a bully is to stand your ground, even when it seems easier to give in. My living room transformed into an evidence processing center. Printed emails, property surveys, weather reports, and photographs covered every surface. I created a precise timeline of events leading up to the accident, including each instance of trespassing, every warning given, and the exact conditions on the day of the incident. The security cameras proved their worth almost immediately. Just 3 weeks after filing her lawsuit, Karen drove by my property in a luxury SUV, slowing down to photograph the pond from the public road. 2 days later, the cameras captured her actually trespassing again, this time on foot, moving cautiously along the property line at dusk. She appeared to be taking measurements and photographs while attempting to stay hidden behind trees. I forwarded the footage to Patricia immediately. "This is incredible," she responded. "She is documenting current conditions to try to support her case, completely undermining her claim that she did not know it was private property." The legal discovery process revealed even more about Karen's history. She had filed similar lawsuits in 3 different counties over the past decade. Most had resulted in settlements, likely because defendants found it cheaper to pay her off than fight in court. One case had gone to trial, where the judge dismissed her claims but did not award countersuit damages, allowing her to continue the pattern without financial consequence. My neighbors proved invaluable. The Johnsons provided copies of threatening letters Karen had sent them regarding their maple tree. The Historical Society shared documentation of her frivolous case against them, including the judge's strongly worded dismissal that questioned her credibility. Each piece added to the clear pattern of behavior. The most significant breakthrough came when I discovered date-stamped photographs from the day before the accident. I had been documenting my erosion control work and had inadvertently captured all the warning signs and property markers in place, the very markers Karen claimed had never existed. Comparing these with photos taken immediately after her rescue showed several signs missing, presumably removed by Karen herself before her reckless ride. Patricia suggested bringing in an environmental engineer to assess the pond and its surroundings. The report they produced confirmed what common sense already indicated. The pond was clearly visible, the warnings were adequate, and the accident occurred solely due to reckless operation of the ATV at unsafe speeds on saturated ground. "The expert report is particularly damning," Patricia explained during our next meeting. "It states that no reasonable person operating a vehicle at safe speeds would have been unable to observe the pond and the warning signs from a distance, allowing adequate stopping time. This directly contradicts her claim that the pond was an invisible hazard." As our court date approached, Karen's attorney reached out with a settlement offer. They would drop the case if I agreed to cover the cost of her damaged ATV, approximately $8,000. Patricia advised against accepting. "This offer indicates they recognize the weakness of their position," she explained. "If we settle now, we recover nothing for your legal expenses or the environmental damage to your pond. More importantly, it allows her to continue this behavior with other property owners." I agreed with Patricia's assessment. This had moved beyond a personal dispute. It felt like a moral obligation to see the case through, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been or might become Karen's target. The day before our court date, we received notification that the judge had agreed to allow evidence of Karen's pattern of similar lawsuits. This was a significant victory. It meant the court would see this not as an isolated incident, but as part of a calculated scheme. That evening, I stood at the edge of my pond, watching the sunset reflect across the now restored water. The ATV had been removed, the contaminated soil replaced, and new plantings established along the damaged shoreline. The financial cost had been substantial, but there was a certain peace in knowing I had protected this place that meant so much to me. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation I had been preparing for over the past months. As I watched a blue heron land gracefully at the pond's edge, the first I had seen since before the accident, I felt a quiet confidence. The truth was thoroughly documented, the evidence overwhelming. All that remained was to present it clearly and let justice take its course. The county courthouse stood imposing against the morning sky, its brick facade and columns projecting an air of solemn authority. I adjusted my tie nervously. The first time I had worn a suit since my father's funeral 3 years earlier. Patricia met me on the steps, her briefcase bulging with our carefully organized evidence. "Remember," she said quietly as we walked through the heavy wooden doors, "speak only when addressed directly by the judge. Answer truthfully but concisely. Let the evidence speak for itself." The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined from television courtroom dramas, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that cast everyone in an unflattering pallor. Karen and her attorney were already seated at the plaintiff's table. She wore a neck brace that had never appeared in any of her social media photos and leaned heavily on a cane. When she noticed me watching, she winced dramatically while shifting position. Judge Miranda Collins entered, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and piercing eyes that seemed to evaluate everything before her. After the formalities, Karen's attorney, Maxwell Harrington, presented their opening statement. "Your Honor," he began in a practiced theatrical voice, "my client was simply enjoying a recreational ride on established pathways when she encountered an unmarked hazard on the defendant's property. A pond with no fencing, inadequate warnings, and dangerous terrain, designed to appear safe, but actually presenting a death trap to innocent passers-by." He displayed enlarged photographs of my pond, all taken from manipulative angles that obscured the warning signs and made gentle slopes appear treacherous. The photos, I noticed immediately, had been taken weeks after the accident, after spring growth had partially obscured some of the signage. When Patricia rose for our opening statement, her approach provided stark contrast. She spoke calmly and directly, without theatrical flourishes. "Your Honor, this case is not about an accident. It is about a deliberate pattern of trespassing, documented with video evidence, followed by an equally deliberate attempt to manufacture a lawsuit. The plaintiff received multiple warnings, both verbal and written, ignored clearly posted signs she herself had repeatedly vandalized, and now seeks to profit from her own reckless behavior." Karen shifted uncomfortably as Patricia methodically outlined the timeline of events, including the certified letter warning of trespassing that Karen had signed for weeks before the incident. When Karen took the stand, her performance was worthy of a daytime drama. She described excruciating pain and emotional trauma in quavering tones. She claimed to have no recollection of any no trespassing signs and insisted there was an implied easement because everyone uses those trails. During cross-examination, Patricia maintained a respectful tone that only highlighted the inconsistencies in Karen's testimony. "Mrs. Westfield, you claim you have been unable to engage in physical activities since the accident, correct?" Patricia asked. "Yes," Karen replied, adjusting her neck brace. "The pain is constant and debilitating." Patricia nodded sympathetically before displaying a large printout of Karen's Instagram post from 2 weeks after the accident, a photo of her water skiing on the lake, smiling broadly with no neck brace in sight. "Could you explain this photograph to the court?" Patricia asked quietly. Karen's face flushed. That was taken before the accident." "The date stamp and your caption mentioning recovery therapy would suggest otherwise," Patricia noted, displaying the full post details on the courtroom screen. The most damning evidence came from the security camera footage showing Karen removing warning signs the very morning of the accident. As the video played, showing her deliberately pulling up markers and tossing aside signs before returning later on her ATV, the courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Collins leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Westfield, are you able to explain this footage?" Karen glanced desperately toward her attorney, who looked equally disturbed by evidence he had clearly never seen. I was removing litter from the trail," she stammered. "The items you removed appear to be property markers and signs stating, 'No trespassing' and 'Danger, unstable ground,'" the judge observed, her tone indicating she was not convinced. When my turn came to testify, I focused on presenting facts clearly. I described my efforts to mark the property, the repeated trespassing, and my rescue efforts after the accident. Karen's attorney attempted to portray me as negligent during cross-examination, but the documentation of my safety measures was too thorough to undermine. The environmental engineer's testimony provided the final piece, confirming through technical analysis what was already becoming obvious. Based on terrain assessment, visibility studies, and standard safety protocols, the property owner exceeded reasonable care requirements for marking potential hazards. By the time closing arguments concluded, Karen had removed her neck brace entirely, apparently forgetting her performance in the face of mounting evidence against her. Judge Collins announced she would review the evidence and issue her ruling the following morning. As we left the courthouse, Patricia looked cautiously optimistic. The judge seemed particularly interested in the pattern of similar lawsuits and the video of sign removal, she noted. Those are not good facts for Karen's case. That night, I barely slept, replaying the day's events and wondering if justice would actually prevail against someone who had so effectively manipulated the system in the past. Tomorrow would reveal whether standing my ground had been worth the financial and emotional cost. The courtroom seemed more crowded the following morning. Word had spread about the case, and several of my neighbors had come to witness the outcome. Karen arrived without her neck brace or cane, perhaps realizing the props had lost their effectiveness after yesterday's evidence. Judge Collins entered precisely at 9 o'clock, her expression giving no hint of her decision. She settled into her chair, arranged her papers, and looked directly at both parties before speaking. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimony in this matter, this court finds in favor of the defendant," she stated firmly. "The plaintiff's claims of negligence and unsafe conditions are wholly unsupported by the evidence. In fact, the evidence clearly demonstrates that the defendant took reasonable and appropriate measures to mark property boundaries and potential hazards." I exhaled slowly, relief washing over me as the judge continued. "More troubling to this court is the substantial evidence suggesting the plaintiff deliberately created the conditions leading to her accident, apparently for the purpose of manufacturing a lawsuit. The video evidence showing removal of warning signs, combined with the plaintiff's documented history of similar claims in other jurisdictions, suggests a pattern of vexatious litigation that this court cannot ignore." Karen's face had lost all color as Judge Collins turned her attention directly to her. "Mrs. Westfield, this court is granting the defendant's countersuit for legal expenses, property restoration costs, and environmental remediation in the amount of $22,500. Furthermore, this court is referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential investigation into insurance fraud and perjury, based on the discrepancies between your sworn testimony and the documented evidence." The gavel struck with finality, the sharp crack echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom. Karen sat frozen in apparent shock, perhaps experiencing for the first time the consequences of her actions. Her attorney was already gathering papers, his body language suggesting he wanted nothing further to do with her case. Outside the courthouse, several neighbors approached with quiet congratulations and relieved smiles. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. "About time someone stood up to her," he said. The Johnsons settled because they could not afford to fight. You did what many of us wished we had done. Ellen hugged me impulsively. This affects all of us, she said. Some of us were afraid we might be next. Thank you for seeing it through. The following weeks brought unexpected developments. Karen listed her house for sale almost immediately. Several neighbors reported receiving apology letters from her, likely advised by her attorney to demonstrate remorse ahead of any potential fraud investigation. The certified check covering my countersuit damages arrived exactly 30 days after the judgment, as legally required. More surprising was the community response. The weekend after the trial, I arrived home to find several neighbors already at work repairing my fence sections and replacing damaged signs. Others had brought native plants to help restore the pond's edge that had been damaged during the ATV extraction. As spring fully arrived, my property slowly recovered its former peace. The pond reflected blue skies once more, fish returned to the restored habitat, and even the heron became a regular visitor again. The security cameras remained, disguised in birdhouses and trees, but now they captured only the occasional deer or fox rather than trespassing neighbors. One evening, as sunset painted the pond in golden light, I sat on the dock I had rebuilt after the incident. The legal bills had indeed been substantial. Even with the countersuit judgment, I had spent considerable savings defending my property. Yet watching the water ripple gently in the evening breeze, I knew the cost of surrendering would have been immeasurably higher. This place of peace had been threatened not just by Karen's entitlement, but by the temptation to avoid conflict at any cost. Standing firm against unreasonable demands had preserved not just my land but something less tangible and more valuable: the knowledge that boundaries matter, that truth can prevail, and that sometimes the act of defending what is right creates unexpected community. The pond caught fire with the last rays of sunlight, glowing like molten gold as darkness gathered. In its reflection, I saw not just the sky and trees, but the outline of a community where people had learned that reasonable boundaries, clearly marked and firmly defended, create the space where everyone can truly flourish.